For those of you who are just here for the business meeting and happen to run into whatever it is we're doing here before, you have come in a little more than halfway through a series on Christians in the world. And how is it that we are in the world but not of the world? How do we work out this tension? What does it look like? And how do we live for maximum witness, the best testimony in a culture that is completely foreign to us? Tonight we're going to look at the example of Paul. I hope. It's the wrong slideshow. It's the wrong one. Wrong one. Technical difficulties. That's okay. We've got the Word of God. Alt 3. 3 Alt 1. I had to redo this week. We're going to be looking tonight at the example of Paul when he is in Athens. You'll find that story in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts 17, and it starts in verse 16 and goes all the way to the end of the chapter. Acts 17, we'll start in verse 16. As we're working out the technical difficulties and you're turning there, let me give you a little bit of background information. You'll find the book of Acts in the New Testament, pretty close to the beginning of your New Testament. It's just past the 4 Gospels. If you get to the book of Romans, he's gone too far. And Acts gives us the history of the early church, the earliest days of the early church, when it's just starting out and beginning to blossom, and the Great Commission is being carried out first in Judea and then into Galilee and Samaria, and then Paul takes it all over the world, which is what he's in the midst of doing in chapter 17. In chapter 17, we see Paul in one of his missionary journeys. He ends up in Athens. Now, the verse before this tells us that he's in Athens as he's waiting. He's waiting. Silas and Timothy were with him on this journey. They're not with him right now. He had left them behind, or they had gone off ahead of him, and he's waiting for them to join him at Athens. So verse 16 picks up in this way. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So right there, that tells me that Paul is listening to the culture around him. He's observing the world around him, and that is something natural for Paul to do. That's his default mode. He's not in full-on evangelistic mode here. He's not in Athens on business, per se. He's on an extended layover in Athens. He's there waiting. But even though he's just waiting for his companions to catch up with him, he's still actively engaging with the culture around him, and he's viewing it and taking it in, and it's provoking the spirit within him, because as he's listening to it, as he's hearing what the city of Athens is saying to him, with its many temples, he begins to understand something about that city, and that understanding is provoking his spirit. That's the first thing that I want you to notice tonight, is that Paul is doing this naturally. This isn't him going out of his way. It's not an extra effort he's making. It just happened. It's natural for him. It's just the way that he is. The second thing that we can notice is that Paul does not simply listen to one artifact, one cultural artifact. And if you weren't here last week, we explained that a cultural artifact is just any piece of culture. Whether that be the chair you're sitting in, or this building, or my slideshow presentation, or these Congos over here, or a ham sandwich you had for lunch. It's all a cultural artifact. And so we're just using that term because that's a lot easier than me giving you a big long list of all the things it could be. But Paul doesn't just take one of those. He doesn't just go to one temple and say, I see this temple over here. And based on this one temple, I'm going to draw all these conclusions. That would be very foolish. Indeed, it would be nigh impossible to really draw anything from that. That would be like if I went to Canton, Ohio, and there's a particular building there, and in that building there's a room, and that room is filled with the bust of various men, bronze bust. And from that one room, I might be able to surmise that I'm standing in the NFL Football Hall of Fame, that all these men have been enshrined here because they were great athletes at this one particular sport called football. But that's about as far as I'm going to get. And so it would be if Paul just took in one temple. He's not going to draw very much from that. But he takes in all the temples, and then you'll see on into verse 28 that he's also drawing from literature, secular literature. He quotes two poets. And it's likely that he's read a lot more than that because they're minor poets. They're not the ones that you would typically think of. He draws multiple examples in order to understand the culture. And if we're going to successfully engage our culture, we also need to understand it. It's not enough just to listen to the artifacts here and there and hear what they're saying. We need to put those together and learn something more. Next slide, please. We need to understand something about them. So like Paul, we need to listen to multiple artifacts. We need to be drawing from multiple places to build a more complete picture. And then we need to ask about all these things we're taking in. Why is this being said? Why does the originator, the author, the musician, the screenwriter, the programmer, the cook, whoever happens to be presenting this, why are they doing it? What motivates them? What's behind the story or the speech or the piece of art or the television show or the ham sandwich? Why is it there? What motivated them to create that? When we ask that question, we are moving into the realm of worldview. I don't know if I have any fellow Bryan alumnus here tonight. If I do, you'll be very familiar with this term worldview, because this is kind of a buzzword in the halls of Christian academia right now. For those of you who haven't been privileged to get this pounded into your head for 4 years, next slide, please. A worldview is simply what it says. It's the way in which a person or group of people views the world around them. And it's the way they perceive reality, if you will. And this is going to determine their values, their behaviors, their outlook. All of that is determined by their view of the world. So we might illustrate this by thinking of John chapter 9, the first couple of verses there. Jesus comes across the blind man, and his disciples display something about their worldview and the way they interpret the presence of this blind man. They say, who sinned, this man or his father, that he should be born blind? That shows that they have a worldview where bad actions lead to bad consequences. The disciples believed in karma. So that's what a worldview is. And of course, Jesus corrects that, but that's a whole different lesson. That's what a worldview is. And when we start dealing with worldviews, now we have something we can respond to. Now we're dealing with the underlying issues that are creating the culture around us. We're not dealing with the surface. We're going beyond that. Next slide, please. This is the substance of response. We don't deal with the surface issues. We don't deal with the cultural artifacts. We deal with the worldview that is underneath that. We don't treat the symptoms of a disease. You don't go to your doctor because your leg is broken and he says, let me dope you up on painkillers so that you will not feel that your leg is broken, and even though it's in two pieces, you won't feel it and it'll be okay. We treat the disease, and then the symptoms go away as you treat the disease. You don't try to go after a tree and you chop off all the branches and then you just leave it there. You just got to dig it up by the roots. If you're into gardening, you don't just go and chop off the head of a weed. That's going to come right back. You've got to pull it out by the root. And so it is when we're dealing with the culture. If you treat the cultural artifact, if you work on the surface level, you're not going to affect any lasting change. You're not really dealing with the root cause. One example of this is rock and roll. When rock and roll comes out in the 50s, we responded on the surface. We just said, it's loud and it's crazy and the kids are acting crazy and we're just going to stop that. We're going to nip it in the bud. We didn't deal with the forces that were corrupting rock and roll. We just heard a loud noise and we reacted against the loud noise without trying to figure out where that loud noise was coming from. That's not what Paul does, not what Daniel does, and it's certainly not what Christ does, because it doesn't work. Next slide, please. So Paul responds to the culture he sees in Athens. He responds in the form of a sermon. And Paul's initial response is he goes to the synagogues. He goes to the synagogues. You'll see that happening in verse 17. And he goes to the synagogues. Why? Because that's where he has an in. That's where he can go. That's the avenue that's open to him. He goes there, and then some of the philosophizers of ancient Greeks, they find him there and they take him to the Acropolis. So Paul starts out where he has an opening, and then from that he gets this great opportunity to speak at the heart of Athenian society. And not only Athenian society, Acropolis is a major center of learning in that day and age. It would be kind of like if I started doing the rounds of the local Christian colleges, and I was going to Bryan and to Covenant and to Union and to Bethel and Blue Ridge and Carson Newman and Sanford and all the others, and then somebody hears me and they say, hey, we want you to come up to Harvard or Yale, or we want you to come over the pond and talk at Cambridge. This is a big deal, and Paul seizes this opportunity and he presents a sermon. And it's interesting what he does in this sermon. The first thing he does, you'll find this in verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. So what is the first thing Paul does? He speaks to them from their own culture. He shows them that he appreciates and understands where they're already at. He says, I perceive you to be religious people. He says, I have found some virtue in your culture. You are seeking after truth earnestly. You want to hear this. And he says, I noticed this particular piece of your culture. Now he built himself a door. He's made a bridge from where they are to where he wants them to be, using something that they themselves have created. Very important. He's won his way in. I'm going to use my mother as an example, even though she's actually here tonight. A couple of years ago, my mom went to Italy with a few other women. And my mom, being the very studious person that she is, you wonder where I get it from, that's where. She wanted to learn everything she could about the culture she was going into. She wanted to know the language and the customs and the good places to eat, and the places that you want to see, and all of these things. And so when she goes over there, she's made this effort, and the other women haven't. They're still talking English and acting American and asking for American food in the middle of Italy, which just seems crazy to me, but that's what happened. Who do you think had the best reach into that culture? Who do you think the Italians appreciated the most? Not a rhetorical question. Who do you think? My mom. Why? Because she showed them that she appreciated them, that she was making an effort to reach out to them. You know somebody in the Bible who did that? Other than Paul. That's not fair. I've got Paul on the screen. I gave that one away. There's another guy. He came before Paul. Paul sees him on the road to Damascus. It's your favorite answer in Sunday school. Jesus. Jesus reaches out, doesn't he? He came down from heaven into the form of a man, a form that we could easily comprehend and understand, so that we could see him and he could walk with us and he could live this life and we could understand what righteousness is because we have the example and a form that we understand. Jesus does exactly what Paul did on a larger scale. But do we do this? Do we reach out this way? Do we try to get into the cultures that we live in even to present the gospel? Are we working to build these bridges? I'm not convinced. But since Paul builds that bridge, he's able to go on in a sermon and to begin to turn into the gospel. And I'll just read this portion to you, to the unknown God. Where therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. So Paul talks to them in a way that they can understand. If you'll notice, he's making a logical argument here. He's not drawing on the Hebrew Scriptures. Not directly. Why? Because the folks in the Areopagus don't have that background. That would be like me going into some part of California where there's no church there, they've never been in church, they don't know anything about church, and I start quoting Scripture to them. And going, haven't you read in Genesis where God makes this promise to Paul and then it's carried out through Isaac? And do you not know that Paul takes this up in Romans and he shows us how this is the promise of Christ in a microcosm, showing us how all of us would be grafted into the tree that is the nation of Israel? And that would sound about as crazy as it just did. Only more so because they don't have the background. But Paul talks to them in a way they can understand. He talks to them using the language of logic and reason, which is what the philosophers of the Areopagus would appreciate. This is what they do all day. This is what they listen to all day. And then he backs it up in verse 28 with this, for in him we live and move and have our being. That's a quote. That is a quote probably from Epimenides of Crete. If you don't know Epimenides of Crete, you're not the only one. And even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. That's from Aratus' poem, Phenomenia. Paul quotes their own culture at them. He picks out some pieces of their literature to reinforce his argument. He's saying, you already have this within your own culture. And so Paul is doing everything here, everything to reach the men of the Areopagus. He is showing them that he appreciates and understands their culture. He's using elements of their culture to convey his message, and he's conveying his message in a way that is relevant and accessible to their culture. Next slide, please. We need to do the same thing. And we need to do the same thing, but it's a little more complicated because we're not looking at one situation like we have with Paul. Our situations are going to be different, and so our responses can take a number of forms. Responses can occur in stages for us. So there might be a situation that arises, such as the issue of the recent issue of gender identity and bathroom assignments, for example. And when that comes up, we need an immediate response. Somebody has to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't good, this isn't cool, we need to slow down, and we need to think about this. There might need to be an immediate response, but that's going to need to be followed up by a substantive response. It's going to be followed up by somebody who's put together and compiled something more substantive, something more forceful, something more profound and robust that can make a better argument, a fuller argument of this is why we don't want to do this. First of all, we're adding to confusion, and second of all, this can be taken advantage of, and sexual predators could use this gender identity loophole to get into places they shouldn't be and to have access to people in a vulnerable situation, and that's not good, and somebody needs to put that all together. So we might have an immediate response, and we have a fuller response, and then maybe the last step is we offer an alternative. Here's a better way forward. Here's a way that we can do this that will solve the problems that we have without creating any new ones. And sometimes it's even more complex than that. Responses also occur on different levels. And some of these you won't see. So sometimes there's a response that needs to be immediate and personal. It needs to be one man to another right there at the scene as it's happening, responding to what's going on. And there might be a more public response. So there might be a response that goes on where it's just the leaders of our denomination in a room praying and going over the scriptures and trying to discern what needs to be done. And then one of them might come out and issue a public statement to the news media that goes out over the internet and on the TV and lets everyone know where we stand. So responses come in all kinds of shapes and sizes depending on the occasion. But they all have to do what Paul did. They all have to reach the culture where it is and build the bridge to where they need to be. Next slide, please. So let's look at some examples of this. Most of you are probably familiar with the Prayer of Jabez by Bruce Wilkinson. If you're not, you have lived under a particularly blessed rock, and I would not advise you to stick your head out for this. Bruce Wilkinson was at one time a great Bible teacher. He did the thing called a walk through the Bible. We still use it at college and seminary. It's very helpful for, the purpose of walking through the Bible, honestly. But at some point, he gets hung up on the Prayer of Jabez, and he fails to interpret it correctly and decides this is some kind of magic formula that we can pray over stuff and God will give us what we want. And he comes out with this, and it just takes off. It's selling gangbusters. The church is going for it left and right. And then there's this guy, Derek Webb. Derek Webb was with a band called Cadium's Call. Now, I've heard that Cadium's Call was a really good band. They were a Christian band, and they were supposed to have some of the best music of the late 80s and early 90s. But Derek Webb gets wind of the Prayer of Jabez. He sees what's going on with that, and so he decides that he needs to take a hard right turn. the church is just sliding off into apostasy and liberalism and health and wealth and prosperity and all of this mess, and he's got to take a hard right turn to try to get it back, to true Christianity. And he ends up releasing this album, She Must and Shall Be Saved. And this album is an attempt to recapture the heart of the church and to bring it back towards orthodoxy, to cause it to stand more firmly on the Word of God and not to slide off into bad interpretations that are really more about self than they are about the glory of God. But the way that he does this is he writes songs with a bunch of cuss words in them. I know at least in one of those he's directly quoting the Apostle Paul, given one modern translation theory. Anyway, but it's not the best response, is it? He didn't really think that through because, why? Because of capturing the heart of the church and pulling it back and saying, "Guy, this prayer of Jabez thing is out of control. This isn't good. This isn't what the prayer of Jabez is about. This isn't what the Bible is about." Instead of doing that, he's created a controversy because a Christian artist is using explicit language. And that's all anybody really ever gets out of this album when it's first released. It takes years for that to calm down. Derek Webb's career still hasn't recovered. It's probably not the best response. Responding takes some consideration. Next slide, please. This is an entirely secular example. Ayn Rand was a writer and a philosopher in the earlier part of the 20th century, and she is herself reacting strongly against communism. She comes out of the Soviet Union and starts proselytizing this philosophy of selfism, this idea that if I look out for me, if I do what's best for me, if I go after what I want, and everybody else does the same thing, the world will be a really awesome place. And there'll be all this innovation, and science and technology will flourish, and art will flourish, and commerce will just explode, and everyone will be prosperous, and it's going to be awesome. Ayn Rand does not have a good grasp of total depravity. A couple of years ago, video game company comes out with BioShock. BioShock is a first-person shooter. It's one of those video games that's pretty violent that we don't like all that much. But BioShock is a brilliant response to Ayn Rand and to her whole philosophy, and in particular to this book, Atlas Shrugged, which is kind of her magnum opus. And so what BioShock does, it goes down to her premise that if I'm looking out for number one, that's going to end up great, and it creates this city that's separated from the rest of the world where they try to live out that philosophy, and it says, well, what would really happen if we gave a bunch of men and women the freedom to just pursue their own interests? What would that really look like? And they paint this vivid picture of the nightmarish dystopia that would result if there were no constraints to human depravity and self-seeking. I believe that's a good response on a couple of levels. One, it's very clear. It draws a very clear line between these two, that BioShock is indeed responding to this. You can't miss that. You can't overlook that. They spell it out very clearly. Secondly, this is effective because it puts you in the middle of the dystopia and lets you walk around in it. It lets you imbibe it almost. It lets you see the results playing out before your eyes in a directly interactive way that even less imaginative people, it can immerse them in that picture. Thirdly, and most importantly, I think that BioShock responds biblically. What does the Bible say about selfism? What does the Bible say about following your heart and doing what's right for you? When does the Bible ever give us an example of that working out good? It doesn't. It always ends badly. Please don't see this as an endorsement of anything I've put up here. These are examples only. You can make up your own mind about if these are worthy pieces of culture or not. Next slide, please. One of the difficulties that we will have in responding to culture is that culture is constantly changing. Culture is a dynamic entity. It's always moving. There are all these forces that cause it to move: technology, politics, economics, all of these things, and others that we're not as aware of. Now, sometimes the culture seems to move very fast. That never happens. Never. Culture is too big a thing to be moved overnight, even by calamity. Now, calamity might bring out a different aspect of the culture, like we saw during the aftermath of 9/11, but that was always latent within it. It didn't really move overnight. It just came to the surface. Culture moves slowly over years and decades. And if you're looking at the right place at the right time, you can perceive that motion, you can track it, and you can react to the motion before it's completed. A lot of that motion is going to seem paradoxical. So an example of that would be the hipster movement, or some are calling it the revenge of analog or the return of analog, where we have this motion in our culture towards digitalization. We're getting into smartphones and MP3s and cloud storage. But then within that, there's a part of the culture that has started off small and it gradually increased and gained momentum that's going back and saying, well, we want the old vinyl records, and we want the old moleskin notebooks, and we want to have an experience more like an analog typewriter. And we want these old cameras from the Soviet Union that didn't work when they were first made, but it looks really gnarly when you take a picture because the light leaks in, and all of these things that seem like they're going backwards. They're going against the tide of the culture. And that kind of stuff happens all the time. Usually you'll see that in one of the subcultures. So we have a large culture here, which is the culture of America, let's say. And then within that, we have a smaller culture, the culture of the South. And then within that, we have a culture that's particular to Tennessee, and then in that there's even a culture that's particular to Central Tennessee or Middle Tennessee, and then within that there's a particular culture of the southern part of the Central, and then there's a subculture that's particular to Lincoln and a subculture that's particular to Flintville. If you don't believe me, travel around to different parts of this county and interact with some of the people, interact with some at the schools, interact with some in their churches, and you'll notice some subtle differences. You can drive about 30 minutes south of here and get into Huntsville, Alabama, and that's a totally different universe. I came out of that universe. I can attest to that. And then even with that, there are subcultures. And then there are subcultures within subcultures. So you could take a group like people who read comic books. And within the people that read comic books, there are people who only read independent comic books. And there are people who only read Marvel and DC comic books. There are people who read superhero comic books exclusively. And then there are people who wouldn't touch a superhero comic book with a 10-foot pole. They're all in this group of people that read comic books that for everyone in here, I'd imagine, except for maybe myself and a few others, that's way off in the fringes of our culture. But even in there, there's an ecosystem of subcultures. Culture is massively complex. Some of you have been in this class on Wednesday night when I've been teaching over the same material, and you watched me try to struggle to come up with examples and illustrations because I don't have a handy slideshow to just feed them to me. And you just watched me almost break down in front of you going, it's so complicated. It's so big and it's so complex and it's hard to wrestle with. And I've been doing this consciously and purposely for 8 years now. And it still staggers me how difficult all this is. It is so difficult that for any one person to try to do all of this work themselves is utter and complete folly. It can't be done. You will get wiped out. Next slide, please. Fortunately, we don't have to do that because God has put us into a faith family. He's grouped us together so that I don't have to know everything there is to know about hunting and fishing because I get to talk to Brother Don, and Brother Don knows more hunting and fishing than I do, and I'm sure there are some of you in here who know more than he does. I can gain from that knowledge, and I can talk to you and see a little bit of that, and I can put it together with the cultures that I'm aware of the things that are going on in other places I've been, the other cultures that I spend time with, and I can create a bigger picture, and so can you. Is one of the awesome things about going to seminary was we were drawing people in from so many cultures, and we got together and started exchanging thoughts and ideas, and we were able to form a greater picture in our community than any of us could have come up with alone. And not only do we have this church here, this morning I was at Milano. Okay, we're in an association, and we've got the whole county covered. This morning I got to see a little bit of what's going on at Milano. And next week, if I so chose, I could sit in on a service at Taft or at Cash Point or Kirkland or Maranatha or my dad still goes to FBC Fayetteville, so I know a little bit about what goes on there. And so I can create a bigger picture of what's going on in the county. And then that takes place within the state convention. And so we've got brothers and sisters in Memphis and Chattanooga and Nashville and Knoxville who can keep up with what's going on there, and we come together and we can exchange all that. And that exists within the Southern Baptist Convention, where we've got guys and just all over the place. The whole United States. We've got churches literally everywhere, and even up into Canada. And we're planting churches around the world all the time, and so we're able to come together in those groups and gain even a global perspective on where things are going. So we don't have to do this by ourselves. But a lot of times we do. A lot of times we fail to take advantage of this. We fail to realize this is out there for this reason. Part of the reason we fail to do that is because we fail to follow the example of Paul in Athens. We don't try to reach out to the culture. We don't try to understand the culture, and we don't work to respond to the culture in an effective and meaningful way right where they're at. Why don't we do that? Well, part of it could be because of the results we see in this scripture. You go all the way to the end of that chapter, it tells you after Paul was finished preaching, what happened. Everybody believes. The whole Areopagus gets set on fire for the glory of God and starts writing academic works to the glory of God, expanding the gospel, and it sweeps through the Roman intellectual world like an unstoppable tidal wave of intelligence, and it takes over academia, and kids are getting raised up through this and the educational program, and it just sets the whole world on fire, and the Great Commission is accomplished in a few short years, right? That's not what happened. The Areopagus is little affected by Paul and all of his efforts here. It says that some follow him, and we know of only two, Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris. That's all Paul sees, two people that we know of, two people that are named, get saved out of all the work that Paul did. That doesn't seem like a good return, does it? Apparently not, because we don't seem to want to do what Paul did. 2 souls aren't enough. If you could tell me that we'd win at least 10, Brother Jared, then we would get behind you on this and we would ride it all the way. But for 2, what is the value of even a single human soul? Priceless. It's priceless. Christ died for the sins of all men, but Christ is of infinite worth. And infinity divided by anything is still infinity. You can't be bothered to be like Paul in Athens. You can't be asked to dare to be a Daniel. You can't live up to the example of Christ. If there's even the possibility of winning a few, you can't become all things to all people so that by all means you might win a few to Christ. I don't think you deserve to bear the name of Christian anymore. Whatever the results may be, it doesn't matter. Because this isn't about results. This is a question of faithfulness. I pointed out in the beginning, and it bears repeating, Paul isn't making a special effort. Paul shows us this is just what Paul does. This is who Paul is. We see that in Jesus too. Jesus isn't making a special effort when he reaches out to the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus isn't making a special effort at the feeding of the 5,000 either time. He's not making a special effort when he cleanses the temple either time. He doesn't make any special effort when the Pharisees come to him, whether it's Nick at night or those who would trip him up by day. Jesus just lives this. Daniel just lives this. And Daniel chapter 1 tells me very clearly that engaging the culture intelligently, listening to it and understanding it, and then responding to it with the truth of the gospel effectively is a matter of obedience to the will of God. It's a matter of faithfulness. The question that I'll leave you with tonight, will you be faithful to do the work of listening to and understanding and engaging culture? And if you come back next week, we'll look at what might result from that. What might a Christian culture look like? But for now, I will open the floor for anyone who has any questions about anything we have talked about here tonight. I have isolated my target audience yet again. Anything at all that anybody feels like we need to discuss a little further? You know, we're all just really eager to get to that business meeting.